Well, hello everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone joining us today in this session on carbon pricing policies in a just transition. This is a workshop that has been organized by the World Bank in the framework of the PMI, the Partnership for Market Implementation, which is, as you might know, the follow-up program to the Partnership for Market Readiness that had been active for the last 10 years. We are really happy to have you join us today. And as you all know, there will not be any sustainable transition if it's not just for all and inclusive. So this is a very important issue that we're going to discuss today. So without further ado, let me introduce our moderator that will lead us through the session today. His name is Miguel Riscalvo, and he is the co-founder of Neyen Consulting and has more than 20 years of international experience around the energy sector, carbon markets, and carbon pricing instruments and policies. And among all of his activities and experiences, he is also leading the African Roundtable on Just Transition. So definitely a great fit to lead us through the discussion today. And without further ado, Miguel, please go ahead, and looking forward to an interesting discussion. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Marlene, and thank you everyone for joining us today in this panel on carbon pricing policies and the just transition. We have a fantastic panel today with Rajendra Sahota from the Climate Resource Board in California, Paula Suarez, the representative of Ecuador at the World Bank, and Stephanie Allegate, the Senior Climate Change Advisor at the World Bank Climate Change Group. And before giving the floor to them, allow me a few minutes to highlight these connections between carbon pricing and just transition. For that, I will share my screen. Hopefully you can see that. And I'm sure we all agree that carbon pricing instruments and policies are one of the key climate actions being implemented by countries to contribute to the Paris Agreement goal of trying to align to 1.5 degrees max temperature increase in the coming years. When we talk about carbon pricing, it's important that we understand it can be both implicit, like implementing an emission trading scheme, a carbon tax, explicit, or explicit, like I'm sure Paula will explain us, like how to remove fossil fuel related subsidies in a jurisdiction. Yesterday, we learned about the state and trends of carbon pricing with the release of the report by the World Bank with data for 2021. We learned that there are around 68 pricing instruments, more or less evenly split between ETS and carbon tax, with more and more countries proposing to develop new instruments in the coming years. We saw last year price records high for carbon pricing in multiple jurisdictions, and revenue accounted for around $84 billion. The right carbon price signal is critical to promote the development of green industries, to promote technology innovation, and to promote behavioral change towards the use of more efficient products and greener products. It's also important to recognize that by pricing carbon, a number of socioeconomic impacts can take place, specifically distributional impact that do not affect everyone the same. As you can see in the screen, this is a study done by the Nobel School of Economics a few years ago on the impact on income impact for different income levels for a carbon tax moving from £50 to £70 in 2030. The impacts will not only be different for different income level, they will be also different in different economic context, regional context, and how the profile of vulnerable groups are in the society. A just transition lens can help us to identify the interconnected nature of impact in different populations, communities, and contexts. It's therefore critical that when designing these instruments and policies, we consider key design features to minimize those potential impacts. It's important to quantify the socioeconomic potential impacts of these policies, taking into account and starting very early with the proper stakeholder involvement in the process. Early planning and early stakeholder involvement is critical to ensure that everyone is involved in the process of understanding why this is needed. We've seen countries, for example, putting in place tripartite working groups that involve the industry, involve labor and union representatives, and policymakers. Equally important that the stakeholder involvement in the process of carbon pricing policies design is society understanding why this is needed, and understanding that, being assured that those that may be affected by these instruments and these policies are being taken care of. Doing that requires thinking carefully on how the revenue used from these instruments is going to be. Revenue collection recycling is one of the critical features for doing so. This is done in multiple countries that we hear now from California as a subnational jurisdiction through different strategies, including direct transfers, decreasing other taxes, social transfers that may make the process and impact easier for households. For the industry, it's important to consider how do we make sure that there is no excessive competitive impact in the domestic industry. The use of targeted subsidies and investment in renewable energy, clean transportation, etc., is critical. With this very generic overview on how implicit and explicit carbon pricing policies and instruments can affect different groups in society, and a very basic concept on how to try to overcome that with the need of a stakeholder consultation, society understanding, the need of modeling this impact early in the process. I would like now to give the floor to our speakers to really go much deeper on how the practical implications they've seen in their jurisdiction, and also what they can tell us is important in this process. Rajinder Sahota, as I said, is the Deputy Executive Officer for Climate Change and Research at the California Air Resources Board. She leads the AB 32 Climate Change Decoupling Plan, the Cap and Trade Program, and other relevant aspects, including overseeing CARB effort on research, including community-informed research for actions to protect public health, especially in front-line communities. Rajinder, the floor is yours, and I'm sure you have, in these few minutes, you can show us both how the cap and trade system in California works, and what are the key features of the system to take care of these potentially negative impacts. Thank you.
Thank you, and good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to share my screen because I do have a few slides, but I wanted to start by thanking the World Bank for the invitation to join you for this conversation. It is a very important conversation. It's certainly been one here in California. And so I just want to start by talking about our targets. You can see that our 2020 target was to return to 1990 levels. We achieved that target early. Our next target is to get down 40% below 1990 levels by 2030. And so that is the target that we are working towards right now. And then there's a further out target for 2050, but we are also looking at carbon neutrality. So lots of active legislation and lots of discussion in California about how we continue and accelerate progress on reducing our greenhouse gases. This is just a picture of the trends in California. As the GDP of the state continued to grow and our population grew, our emissions have gone down. Our emissions per capita went down and our emissions per GDP went down. So we've had a good set of trends leading into 2019. Of course, 2020 is not on here, but that is much, much lower due to the impacts of the pandemic. And we would treat that as an outlier in the data set when we get that data point. It's always good for us to think about the sectors that contribute to greenhouse gases. And this is very relevant in some of the programs that we set up for the just transition. The majority of our emissions are coming from the transportation sector. And then half of the industrial sector is oil and gas extraction and refining. California is a significant oil producing state. And that is usually not known, but together the production and then the use of transportation fuels means that 50% of our GHGs, greenhouse gases, come from the transportation sector. And then you have the traditional other sectors for electricity, and we import a significant amount of electricity for our consumption. Overview of the program, many of you will be familiar with this. We have declining caps. We have a long-term increasing price signal with an auction floor price that raises 5% plus inflation each year. We target the lowest cost reductions, and we have our policies work with other clean air programs so that they are cumulative in benefits. So climate mitigation and racial equity is a really big thing in California. We do have lots of frontline communities because of traditional federal, state, or historical federal, state, and local actions meant that communities of brown, Black, and often low-income households are now located adjacent to our major freeways, to our ports, and our large industrial sectors such as gas plants and manufacturing. And so we set out with the premise that all of our actions must protect public health and address those opportunity gaps. And that these residents in these burdened communities must be the first to benefit from climate action, and that our carbon pricing funds must be reinvested to benefit those communities. To date, over 50% of the cap and trade revenue is reinvested back to provide benefits into those communities, and I'll speak to what those benefits look like. A recent report was put out and talked about the actual emission reductions that have occurred from this time period. And while it's hard to identify and isolate the impact of any one program when you have lots of programs at the federal, state, and local level, we have seen that in our communities that are the most heavily burdened, that they have seen the most reduction in exposure to harmful local air pollution. And so there was this concern that programs like cap and trade, market programs, and trading programs could concentrate air pollution, harmful air pollution in these communities. That has not been the case. And in fact, we have seen that the communities have seen some of the greatest benefits in reductions in emissions for GHGs and local air pollution. And that report came out earlier this year. It's important to know our allowance budget. We see here what our caps look like. In 2015, the program doubled in size because we brought in our transportation sector. And we have the traditional allocation of allowances each year, some to our cost containment reserve, some to our utilities, industry, and then that gray portion at the bottom is the state-owned allowances that we sell at auction, and that money is then reinvested by our legislature and our governor's office into priorities for the state, such as that 50% for heavily burdened communities. I want to talk a little bit about the state-owned. So this was the state-owned allowances. This is the program. It is a logo that talks about how we get the money from the cap and trade program. It goes back into recycling proceeds back into our climate investments program. And our climate investments program then has investments in things like rebates for zero emission vehicles, rebates for solar panels on roofs. It also talks about urban forestry planning, mass transit options with clean transit. And I think the next slide talks specifically about many of the program outcomes that have been achieved to date. So affordable housing units under contract. So that means that we're reinvesting in quality and low carbon footprint housing for our residents. We're planting trees. We're also looking at land preservation and restoration, such as our wetlands regions. And again, the transit and the zero emission rebates are a really big part of this program, because that ties back to the fact that most of our local air pollution and our greenhouse gases are the result of our transportation sector. They are the result of the combustion of petroleum, gasoline, and diesel fuels. We also have this utility allocation where we give our utilities allowances. Those allowances are consigned at auction alongside the state-owned allowances, and then they are provided back for ratepayer benefit. So the majority of that value, once those utility allowances are consigned at auction, is returned on your bill twice a year to consumers in California. So if you're a gas customer, your electricity customer, twice a year, you see a rebate on your bill that says you're getting some money back, even though you've seen a pass-through cost for carbon on a month-to-month basis. This climate credit that comes up on the bill is given back at a non-volumetric measure, which means that whether you used your energy bill is $40 a month or whether it's $300 a month, you all get the same $80 credit. And that is to make sure that we are not rewarding high users by scaling that credit to how much electricity or gas that they use. And so we did not want this to be regressive. We wanted this to also be mindful of the fact that everyone should get the same amount back and not to incentivize more energy use by having that wrong incentive that the more you use, the more of this climate credit that you get back. To date, 13.7 billion has been returned back. And so it's a huge amount that has been returned to customers, residential customers in California, and that has been generated as part of this utility compliance mechanism. And that's the end of my presentation. I just want to say that we were very mindful in the design of our program here, and the two mechanisms that I just talked through, the Climate Change Investments Program and the Utility Allowance, are very directly designed to make sure that we get money and we get climate credits in a way back to communities that are already overly burdened in California. The budget that the governor has put out for this year also proposes $1 billion in investments in training and apprenticeships so that we can actually support the workforce development in some of the regions of the state as well that have not seen that kind of investment historically. And with that, I will conclude my presentation and look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Rajinder. Very good presentation. Very interesting to see specific examples of what we were discussing before, right? So how specific measures can support these minimizing the potential negative impacts of carbon pricing and how they can support the disadvantaged groups or low-income family groups. It was very interesting to see how almost 50% of the revenues has been sent back to frontline communities and how this carbon credit for gas has reinvested almost $14 billion to Californian users. So with this, I think we are going to have the opportunity now to have a different perspective and go to a carbon pricing, a way of dealing with carbon pricing that is linked to reducing or eliminating subsidies. And Paula has direct working experience and both, I guess, was a fantastic opportunity for her, but also some challenging experiences on how to do this in Ecuador, the experience they went through, and what are the lessons learned for other countries, right? And how to make sure that we all learn from these processes. So Paula, as I mentioned before, is a senior advisor to the executive director of the bank and delegate from Ecuador from the World Bank. She has multiple positions in the World Bank, including economist at the Poverty and Equity Global Practice. With no further ado, Paula, please go ahead.
Thank you, Miguel. I also prepared some slides, so let me see if I manage to share my screen. You let me know if this is working. Is it working? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Yes.
Great. And you can hear me too, right?
Yes.
Okay, great. So yes, as Miguel was saying, you know, when we approach carbon pricing, I'm also the delegate of the government of Ecuador to the Coalition of Ministers of Finance for Climate Action. And one of the principles that the coalition endorses and pushes for is this idea of equilibrating the price of carbon, right? To allow for renewable energies to compete in a fair way. And that is why we started the working group on fossil fuel subsidy reform, because a lot of countries, not only do they not have a tax on carbon, but they are also subsidizing carbon, right? So subsidies in a way work as an implicit negative price on carbon. So that's why we're working on this. And today, I think that talking about the example of Ecuador, the efforts of reform, the successes and also the failures of those reforms could be very, very insightful as we think about carbon pricing and just transition. So thank you very much for having me today and for making me part of this conversation that I think that it's ongoing and that we should help evolve as we think, especially I put here, as you can see in the title, just transition in quote marks, because I think that there's a lot of relative conceptions about that we think that that I think that we should start thinking about. So let me see. Yeah. So why talk about this? As I was saying, I think that it could be very, very insightful. I was involved in this process firsthand, so I'm going to give you a very quick review of what the context was like when we started working on this in 2018. So the first thing is that reforms do not happen in a vacuum. So sometimes we look at just the instrument, just the price of carbon, how many emissions, by how much we want to reduce them, but there's a broader context where these decisions are made. And in the case of Ecuador, what was happening when we started working on this in 2018 was that the growth had been very volatile and mostly state-led. The fiscal situation was very bad and worsening almost by the day. That there was a huge debt accumulating. And as we all know, when we look at the budget, and energy subsidies in the case of Ecuador were a big chunk of the budget, not only were they not environmentally friendly and actually perverse by having this implicit subsidy, but also they were socially perverse, meaning that the subsidies are very regressive. Most of the population benefiting from these subsidies were in the higher part of the distribution. So it made all the sense in the world to work on this from a health perspective, from a social perspective, from an environmental perspective, and from a fiscal perspective. So we got a lot of technical assistance from all the stakeholders and international stakeholders involved in working the technical solutions to go about this. And we were looking at this in terms of the social structure of the subsidy, right? Like it was so huge that, just to give you an idea, a liter of diesel was costing around $0.25, cheaper than Coke, cheaper than milk, cheaper than water. So it was really, really something that we needed to tackle. And the way that the government approached this was in December 2018, with that initial removal and liberalization of the higher type of gas for cars. The cars that normally use this are high-end cars that people who you would assume that do not necessarily need a subsidy. And that was relatively successful. The price of this gas has been liberalized and is still in the market. So it has all the fiscal benefits and also the economic benefits of having people perceive the economic cycle and how it internationally impacts the domestic finances. So as part of this policy context, about 4 months into that reform, the government signed a program with the IMF, of course, with very strict fiscal targets, and also with other multilaterals, including the removal of these subsidies, basically because it makes so much sense. And as part of that program, in October 2019, the government decided to eliminate all the fossil fuel subsidies, liberalize the prices, and having done all the distributional analysis, established a way to compensate the population that was going to be affected with a direct cash transfer. They had some communication in place, but this triggered very, very violent social protests. I here have a few pictures, but just to give you an idea, the country was paralyzed for about 2 weeks, and everything that was happening in the period of fiscal consolidation, adjustment, mistrust in the government, the fall of the price of oil that basically stopped growth, all the social demands kind of converged in this place, right? And had this as the perfect trigger for all sorts of violence. It was really probably one of the worst crises that the country has seen. And Some of the protests were very, spontaneous and legitimate, and kind of harness all this mistrust and dissatisfaction that the population was feeling. But at the same time, it was the perfect space for all other political interests to kind of emerge and have an organized and almost strategic campaign to basically start a coup. And all this because the removal of the subsidies was like the perfect ignition of to start this crisis. So the government had to backtrack on the decision. Subsidies were reinstated, and one of the you were talking, Miguel, about lessons that we've learned, and I think that this shows Ecuador is not the only case where this has happened, by the way, right? It has even happened in countries like France with the Gilets jaunes, and so just when it's really easy sometimes for us to talk about carbon price, but I think that it's important to understand the system where these decisions are being made. How are the other policies, the interplay between these policies? What are the social and political conditions? Because the reforms to the prices of energy are particularly sensitive. They threaten grain interest. They do not come as a technical solution, but they have a lot to do with the history. And there's also a real connection in the value chain of so many things that are associated with energy. And now, with everything that's happening with the Russia and Ukraine crisis, we can see that unfolding in several countries, right? So when we're working on this, and I put these 3 slides that basically want to convey that it is not a simple problem, right? So like making a cake is a simple problem, building a bridge is a complicated problem but doable. But working on these type of reforms, I think that's more like raising a child. So it's kind of like a very, very complex problem where we need to find things along the way. This is a little bit of the timeline of what happened after. So after the government had to backtrack, the political environment was even worse, and there was, like big reforms that were rejected by Congress. And then the pandemic, by lowering the price of oil. So remember, there were even days where the price of oil was negative, provided a window of opportunity for the government to kind of adapt this reform. And in June 2020, so about 8 months after the backtracking, we put in place a reform that actually was increasing the price of fossil fuels by, especially diesel, the one that I showed you the picture comparing with the Coke, by 5% a month. And we put a trajectory for that. So it was increasing. And there's a mistake in the slide because it was not it was in 20, oh no, I think it's the right date, in 2021. So that reform was in place for 1.5 years. And then the social demands also were so high that the government had to not backtrack in this case. So we increased the price of diesel, but we had to freeze that trajectory, right, until we find another window of opportunity to continue with that. The subsidies have reduced in about a little more than 1% of GDP by now. So there's a lot of progress that happened in this adaptation and understanding where people were coming from and where the challenges were. And in terms of how to think about this.
Sorry for jumping in. We really need to.
Yes, let me just wrap up, and I'm happy to leave the slide, but there are these elements that, about the history, where are the benefits, who are the interest groups, people are more averse to lose than to the possibility of winning, where are the windows of opportunity, how to manage the communication, and the coherence with other policies and long-term vision. And with this, I'm gonna wrap up. Just leaving you with, I think, that a few questions that could be important as we think about this. So this idea of just transition, how relative it is to who are the players in the field and who are the stakeholders related and how things are seen from their perspective. The importance of doing distributional analysis, but that not being enough. the importance of coming up with creative ways to communicate, but again, that not being enough without a proper understanding of the political landscape. And how can we talk about these problems in a way that the people that need to care more about them? And with that, I'm gonna stop. Thank you so much, Miguel. Sorry for going over
Paula.
time.
No problem. Thank you, Paula. Very, very interesting case, and it's fantastic to see, and at the same time sad to see how even knowing that energy subsidies were heavily regressive as they were designed, and having done all this distributional impact analysis and having in place having designed the specific compensation measures for those who were going to need them, even so it didn't work at the beginning, right? And so a very interesting case, and I'm sure there will be plenty of questions during the QA session for you. So with this, we are going to hear now from Stefan Hallegate, a senior climate change advisor at the World Bank Climate Change Group. She has extensive experience in the academic world with many different areas related to both mitigation, adaptation, and he has done a lot of research on for example, the link between adaptation and power through reduction. So Stefan, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And indeed, it was really interesting to go through those examples. I just very briefly wanted to take a step back on the concept of just transition, because I think one point that is really important is how this concept depends on the country we're talking about and the context. And very often you have a discussion on the just transition focusing on the climate policies we put in place and carbon pricing for the topic of today. But the current situation in most countries is not considered just, right? You have groups disadvantaged, you have people who benefit more from the growth path than others. And I think there is a lot of confusion in the definition of just transition, in the sense that it's unclear what we're trying to do with the just transition. Is it just to ensure that what we're doing with our carbon pricing instruments or climate policy is just? Or is it something much broader that tries to just improve the situation, taking into account the existing issues, challenges, especially linked to lack of inclusion? So that's one point that sounds really important to me when we hear about the case of Ecuador, or the case of Chile, or in France, the Gilets jaunes. A lot of the reactions were about the existing situation and the interplay of the existing situation with the policies being proposed. But if you look only at the policies being proposed, you cannot anticipate the reaction, because it's very much linked to the pre-existing situation. I also wanted to flag the difference between the just transition and the political economy. I mean, sometimes the political economy, making the policy actually doable, requires to make it less just. I mean, this is well known that in all countries you have interest groups, sometimes with veto power, and you see compromises to make policy possible, and it doesn't always means that it's more just. It's just more feasible. I think it would be also very useful to just separate those issues. One being really justice and an ethical need to make sure climate policies benefit the poorest and help us going toward more inclusion, and the political feasibility and the type of compromise that sometimes we have to do to just make it possible. And just to conclude on the channels. So I think Miguel, you showed these different channels through which carbon pricing and other policies will be affecting the distribution. I just want to flag a few of the technical issues we have to really capture what's going on. So there are like the consumption channel, there is the income channel. On the consumption channel, we find that in many low-income countries, carbon pricing will be progressive, and it's considered a good thing. But we have to be very careful with very static analysis. So in many countries, very low income countries, carbon pricing is progressive only because very poor people don't have access to modern energy. They use biomass for cooking and and the rest of their energy needs. And we don't like the situation. It's very bad for health. It's bad for gender balance. It's bad for development. So there is a question of, even if at one point in time, your pricing instrument is progressive in the sense like poor people are not affected because they don't use modern energy, are we creating an additional barrier for people to make the shifts from traditional energy to modern energy? So we really have to look beyond the static situation at one point in time, but look at the long-term view, and the picture might be different when we do that. On income, on the income channel, what I wanted to flag is, for consumption, it's relatively easy to compensate. And we have had examples before, cash transfers. There are many ways of compensating people if the price of certain things become higher. For people losing their job, or entire, sometimes cities looking in industry, throwing just cash at the problem is not what people expect. It's not only about maintaining income, it's also about creating new livelihoods, helping communities transition to different types of activities. And on that, it's much more difficult to do. It's not only that you need resources to spend on it. You need much more of planning, much more investment in infrastructure. Sometimes like tax reforms can help. And here, I think we really need to look not only at energy subsidy reforms, but at what we learn from trade reforms, or what we learn when some big industries collapse. Like I'm thinking about the ship making industry, for instance, in Japan or in Sweden. Those countries had policies to help workers transition to other activities. And it's much more complicated than just doing cash transfers. And on the channels, my last point will be about the spatial dimension. When we do distribution analysis, you see a lot of these figures with different income quintiles or deciles, and you look at whether the poor benefit more or less than the rich and so on. But in many cases, the problem is spatial. Like depending on where you live, you are affected differently. And I think we need to do a much better job at understanding the spatial distribution effects. Because when you have a community, when you have a neighborhood more affected than others, this is where you get this amplification of your problem, because their community is suffering. And when we look at the protests that we had in France, for instance, they were very geographically restricted, because there are some places that are suffering from the reform. So just a few ideas for the work we have in front of us to answer, I guess, Paula's call to take into account all of those different dimensions in a much better way, and understand why, even when we feel we've been doing a good job, sometimes the reform cannot be implemented. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefan, and very, very interesting points, right? And pointing out to the need to consider the interplay between the new policies to address carbon pricing and the interplay with existing circumstances, right? As you pointed out, happening in France and other countries. Your last part of your presentation on how it affects consumption, income, and in different ways, when I would say that in just transition is always a challenge to have an overview of these impacts, because two things happen. One is this mismatch that you refer to, the spatial mismatch, right? The impacts and the opportunities happen in different places where the intervention is taking place. And also the temporary mismatch, like the example you put on, by introducing these policies, are we putting a higher barrier for using other cooking methods for low-income families, right? So handling these mismatch, spatial and temporary mismatch in the discussion around just transition impacts is a challenge and very interesting topic. So we have a few minutes left for questions. Let's see what if we have any of them in the. I think there is one in the chat. I invite everyone, please, to send all the questions you may have for the panelists in this chat that you can see in the bottom of your screen. There is one from Sophie Erendal saying that, are there any indicators showing the cap and trade social impact? For example, on energy power tree or other fossil fuel sector employment versus the green sector employment. So does anyone of you want to address these questions? So how these, I understand one specific case is in this question is really these policies and the employment opportunities larger in the green sector than in fossil fuel intensive sectors.
I'm happy
Rajinda, please.
Yeah, I'm happy to take that first. I did post into the chat a couple of reports that were done very early in the program by UCLA. One of them was about jobs and one of them was about financial impacts to low-income households. So those reports were done very early in the program, and they did talk about how investment of the monies from cap and trade and the signal to actually build cleaner energy and cleaner infrastructure can create jobs in sectors that we want to see grow in the state of California. And that over time, there may be a contraction in the jobs in the petroleum sector. And as you saw on my slide, we talked about how half of our industrial sector is oil and gas extraction and petroleum refining. This is a huge ongoing topic still here in California. Those jobs are probably about 250,000 in a population of 30 million for the state of California. I think maybe 40 million now in the state of California, but it is a very, very high paying job in that industry, in the petroleum industry. And so while there may not be a one-to-one replacement for that kind of quality job, it may be other forms of that. And so we continue to engage with the labor groups that represent those workers to understand and map the paths for the different industries that we want to move forward with and how those can be mapped together and we can move existing skills into the new sectors that we want. There is a lot of sensitivity when we say that we're going to train people for the new jobs because there is a strong skilled workforce already here. And the goal is to not just train for the new jobs for people who are coming into the job market, but also making sure we take care of the people that already have skills in the job market and mapping those skills to where we need to go.
Very interesting. Reskilling, retraining is always a hot topic when we discuss just transition, right? And I would like to add to that the education, right? So we need to start doing that, shifting and revising the education programs that are offered in the countries, right? To make sure that we have more sustainability and green sector focused engineers and experts and less of them focus on fossil fuel intensive industries. So maybe, Stefan, if I may, while we get more questions from the audience. So what would you say are the difference in how developing and developed countries can address this process of carbon pricing instruments design? Are they facing the same challenges, or is this more difficult for developing countries than for developed countries?
I don't know if it's more or less difficult, but certainly the challenges are not the same. And I will flag two very important points to consider. First is the importance of informal labor in developing countries. So very often when we think about retraining, we think about social protection to help people transition. It's much easier to do with formal workers. They are registered, that the job does exist. But for everybody working in the informal sector, it might be much, much more challenging. So here we really need to be creative, right? We need social protection system that cover the whole population, not only the formal workers. And we might have to create new instruments to target these people. And here we have really the big choice, right? Either you do something specific to manage your just transition in the climate domain, or much better, you use the momentum that you create to improve the social protection system to help move people toward formality. So that's one thing that needs to be discussed country per country. The second thing, which is really important, is the lack of access to basic infrastructure. So while in developed countries, we often talk about the revenues from a carbon tax recycled by reducing other taxes. In many low-income countries, they really struggle to finance the infrastructure and the public goods the population needs: health, education, access to energy. So in many low-income countries, the revenues from carbon pricing might be best used to increase spending by the governments to provide those services. So very different challenges, but also very different solutions. But this is really caricature because every country is different on that. So it really takes a lot of diagnostic before we start to know what to do and what to focus on.
Thank you, Stefan. Yeah, informal labor sector and yeah, the clashing priorities, right, in developing countries are critical. You pointed out to the use of revenues. I think it's important to realize that for being able to recycle revenues, you need to design a carbon pricing instrument that produces revenues, right? And we all know that not in the carbon tax, but more in the ETS design during the first few years, the tendency is to have free allocation of allowances, and therefore you will not see much revenue coming in. So a point to be taken into account. We have a few minutes left, as we don't have, or I don't see new questions. So Paula, what would you recommend a country that is starting this process now? How would you recommend them to do this differently to what was maybe done in your experience? How could they avoid those pitfalls? Or you have to start again, right? What should have Ecuador done differently at the beginning?
So thank you for that question, because it actually, you know, the country kept on its objective of removing the subsidies, and something that did happen and they've done really well is to move to a gradual approach, right, where this perception of change is not as large, and that it allows for all the economic actors to adapt to the new circumstances until the price was already too high. But that allowed for, you know, a huge reduction in the subsidy, just to move to a gradual approach where the compensation was probably more direct, and especially taking advantage of this opportunity of having a lower price, right? Because that allowed for you know, you can liberalize the price, but it has a lower impact. And then I wanted to put two other things on the table, and it's this exactly what Stefan was saying. There's also the space variable, but there's also the between countries and within countries, right? And it is not the same. So for example, within the carbon price group of the coalition, one of the mechanisms that is being discussed is the border adjustment, carbon border adjustment. So basically all the imports and exports that countries allow into their economies, they are going to have to be adjusted by the carbon that they produce. And there's a lot of implications in terms of trade that may happen and that may arise from there that probably were not taken into account, in case that may or may not be fair to countries that are starting to access markets, that are emerging markets, developing countries. So there's an aspect there that should be considered. And I think that in the negotiations at the COP, countries like Ecuador were raising their hand and saying, hey, let's look at this aspect of carbon border adjustment before we moved into, you know, thinking, oh, this is a great idea because we're going to adjust for the carbon intake of all these products. And then the other one, for example, we just had a tax reform, a very, very important tax reform that taxed the wealthiest part of the population. And of course, we had all the partners come to us and say, oh, this is the perfect time to increase and put a tax on the vehicles that pollute the more. But then when you look a little bit deeper and go a little bit into the finer analysis, you realize that the people who actually have the cars or can buy the old cars that pollute more are the people who have less money, right? That are in the lower part of the distribution. So as a government in a time of crisis right after the pandemic, there's really not a lot of space to increase the tax on those cars that pollute more, that would hit exactly the middle class that are just trying to find their way on a day-to-day basis. So again, this thing of like looking at the system, the interaction, the interplay between the policies, and what are people feeling right now that in terms of their well-being, and how we can think about the future and make them value the future a little bit more. And those are the challenges and the questions that I think that could guide policy reforms.
Thank you, Paula. And we have only a few seconds left for the session. I would like to thank Regina, Stefan, and Paula for your contribution, the World Bank for inviting me to moderate this section. I hope that we were able to give a few just feed people's thoughts on the challenges on how to properly design a carbon pricing instrument and the need for really considering this impact from the very beginning, not only from the negative point of view, but also, as Stefan just posted in the chat, looking at the opportunities, right? What are the opportunities to use these in a way that benefits all beyond helping us to transition to net zero economies in the future? So with this, thanks everyone. We are only 1 minute late. So Marlene, maybe you want to say some closing remarks, and if not, thank you everyone.
Thank you everyone for participating and also for this very interesting panel. And we could definitely have talked a lot longer, but it's always great to get the discussion started. And yes, thanks again and have a good rest of the day. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.